We'll start with introductions, so anybody joining a little bit late won't miss too much. So, hello everyone. My name's Tim Erridge. I'm the Vice President of Europe, Middle East, and Africa for Unit 42 here at Palo Alto Networks. I'm joined with my colleagues. David, do you want to do your intro?
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. My name is David Faraone. I'm a Senior Director in our U.S. East region of our Unit 42 consulting team, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you. And then also here with me today is LeeAnne. LeeAnne, do you want to do your own introduction?
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. My name is LeeAnne Pelzer. I'm a consulting director as a part of our proactive services group. So really looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you both. Thank you for your time this evening and today. And yeah, really looking forward to having a bit of a slightly different stance on the whole Log4j topic. So I'll start by giving a caveat that this is not yet another threat briefing. This is not yet another vulnerability briefing. What we're looking to talk about today is really how do you communicate about everything that's been going on with your C-suite, your board? How do you put this into executive language? And how do you really kind of focus in on the important work that you've been doing, your teams have been doing, everyone's been working hard over the holiday periods to try and address this. So let's really try and, maximize the awareness of everything that's been going on, and also seize the day on this as an opportunity. And we'll kind of come to what I mean by that as we go through the session. So just having said it's not yet another threat briefing or vulnerability briefing, I just did want to do a quick recap. So I'm sure everyone who's joined is more than aware of Log4j, the vulnerability that was found, and executions in the wild reported just over a month ago. We all are more than aware that there's public not only proof of concept, but now successful exploitation attempts, and it's been embedded into several payloads. It's in a piece of software that is fairly ubiquitous out there. It's used in a lot of your environments, in a lot of your applications and software, supporting a lot of your business functions. And we are seeing firsthand, and we'll give you some data points on this in a minute, just how widely attackers are trying to leverage this new vulnerability to meet their objectives, right? So I'm not going to dwell on this. What we want to do is move forward and talk about why this matters to the board specifically. So with that, I'm going to just hand over to you, David, to just cover this slide, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. And if you look at over the last 4 weeks, where the proverbial dust has settled in terms of the vulnerability being disclosed and people taking action against the vulnerability, I don't think any CISO slept the weekend of December 10th. But in terms of the victims, now we're measuring this based off of the actual magnitude of the number of exploit hits, and you'll see that in the next slide, actually. But before we get there, if you look at some of the application counts, we're seeing that grow day by day. Just a couple days ago, the United Kingdom NHS released on January 7th that attackers are actively exploiting Log4j vulnerabilities in unpatched VMware Horizon instances. So if you look at the VDI infrastructure there, that's a vulnerable variant. And then if you look at some of the GitHub repositories, there's over 2,900 applications that are affected by Log4j, and of course a lot of those vendors are actively patching those, in addition to bringing out net new releases to make sure that their software is patched. So if you look at that scale, it's thousands, and you'll see in the next slide in terms of how many hits we see per day. But the scale is exorbitant in terms of the magnitude of the issue. So we're all aware that it was a CVE magnitude of level 10. So we're seeing that because of the remote code execution probability, that it is something that it's on the top of the radar for all organizations. So when you get into the cost implications, not only are you seeing the cost churn from the analysis, as I mentioned, no CISO slept that weekend. Now her or his team didn't sleep that weekend either, in terms of being able to, analyze the network, analyze the systems, parent, child, sister relationships that are in place that have the Log4j instance. And then when it comes to adversaries, we're seeing that Unit 42 has done a lot of analysis on the types of obfuscation that's being done from an HTTP request perspective. We also seen some research from Microsoft that efforts are underway by threat actors to evade string matching detections by obfuscating their HTTP requests. So if you flip to the next slide, you can see the numbers. In terms of, we're seeing right around 5 to 7, 8 million per day exploit attempts. So the key theme here to take away from this part of the talk is that you shouldn't let up your defenses. You should not let up your monitoring. You shouldn't let up your initiatives to continue to assess your vulnerabilities for the Log4j variant in terms of your initiatives ongoing. So you want to make sure that you're actively monitoring your attack surface from an external and internal perspective. So if you can go to the next slide. And then you get into, as Tim was articulating, why does this matter to the C-suite, to the board, to the audit committee? One of the things we're going to dive into in terms of questions is what matters to them? What matters to the board, to the C-suite? We talked about some cost implications in terms of the churn on the team, but also what are some of the intangible costs that are resulting in the focus? As of December 10th, any project that the CISO's team was focused on, there's a good chance that project was deprioritized. And so defenses from a visibility perspective could have been taken away from a focus perspective on Log4j that let other areas within the environment vulnerable. So you have to take that into consideration in terms of indirect cost. And then from a business imperative perspective, if you look at some of the strategic risks, we talk about a little bit later, some of the third-party risk around if the software supply chain is impacted by Log4j, how does that impact any strategic initiatives that were planned in this cycle year roadmap? And then, of course, board members are going to be curious on reputation. The FTC recently basically released a warning that they intend to use their full legal authority to pursue companies that fail to take reasonable steps to protect customer data from exposure from this vulnerability or similar vulnerabilities. So that's another thing we want to touch on from a question perspective is board members are going to want to know, how are we protecting ourselves from these types of zero-day variants, right? And then you get into legal regulatory compliance. How are you exercising due care? And then, of course, operational disruption. Board members are going to be curious on what resilience processes are in place for operational resilience. So I'll turn it back over to Tim to fire into the next the set of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that insight, Dave. I think my key takeaway from this slide is really like, this goes above and beyond just the tactical response, right? You've got to be thinking about this holistically in the round and thinking about all impacts, both security and resilience, as well as business impacts. And that's definitely what the C-suite, the senior executives and the board members are going to be interested in zeroing in on. So with that, we sort of put our heads together and had a bit of a think about what would be the top 5 big, home run hitting questions that if in your next presentation to the board you get asked, that we can help prepare our audience for smashing out of the park, basically, for knocking them down and having hopefully prepped and having all the answers to really kind of help the board sleep at night. So with that, the first sort of key high level question we felt would come out of the mouths is, what is our risk exposure? And, has it been realized? Have we had any impact? And so, LeeAnne, how do you think about that as a question that you might face from the board?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Tim. So I think of this question as, what is the likelihood that something bad's going to happen, and just how bad is it going to be, right? So risk exposure is calculated by likelihood times impact. But the board obviously isn't thinking in the sense of equations. They're thinking, how is this going to impact our business critical functions? How are we going to keep our customers happy? How are we going to keep key data protected? How are we going to process that data? How are we going to do the things that we need to do to continue generating revenue? So that kind of explanation there ties back to that first subtext question. Are business critical systems and data impacted, and how is it going to impact our business? This is also a core key of resiliency, right? So there's recovery, which is how are we going to recover from this? And then there's resiliency, which is how are we going to stop the bleeding and keep being able to deliver those critical functions from a business aspect. So that's definitely going to be on the top of everyone's mind from a board and exec level, because at the core of what a business needs to function is those critical applications and those critical systems. The second point here is, what have we done to limit that exposure? How are we making sure that those critical applications can continue to function? What are we doing to make sure that our business has those key elements and has very sturdy legs that we need to keep functioning on a day-to-day basis? And then finally, and something that at Palo Alto we have been putting a huge amount of time and effort into with our clients, what about strategic partners and third-party vendors? As if it isn't hard enough to manage the Log4j vulnerability with your own internal software pieces that you should hypothetically have a good grasp on, what about all the vendor software? There has been a huge amount of vendor outreach, of just plain confusion, of back and forth communication, of vendors trying to understand if they are using that particular logging package. So that is something that we're really encouraging that clients should pay special attention to, corresponding with their vendors, strategic partners, getting an understanding what they are doing to limit the Log4j risk exposure, but also following up and making sure that if there isn't an initial answer, that they remain persistent in hopefully getting to a better understanding of if that piece of software does leave them susceptible.
Thanks, LeeAnne. So, David, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I had to add on, and LeeAnne is spot on, and just wanted to hook on to that last data point you mentioned around the third parties and the strategic partners. You know, one of the things that we talk about a lot is asset management. You'll probably hear it throughout this whole talk in some of the responses, but when it comes to third party inventories, this is a key one, right? Because if you look at things like the ambiguity around this vulnerability, a lot of the SOC teams and the CISOs were scratching their head around the parent, child, and sister dependencies that were required, that were being asked upon them on where is this located. So a lot of third parties had Log4j. And so if you look at from an inventory perspective, a key question a board member may ask is, okay, of our high risk third parties, which one of them has this under control in terms of mitigating the Log4j vulnerability? So having a risk stratification around your third parties based off of the product or service that's being used is key, right? And then from there, you can execute your due diligence to whether it's a survey, whether it's a phone call, whether it's an assessment to validate that third party that your organization heavily relies on is doing their due care to treat the Log4j vulnerability.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I guess it's a really good underscoring of what a lot of professionals have been talking about in our industry, which is the large integrated complex business ecosystem, the ever expanding attack surface. This is the epitome of that, right? In that that your risk exposure does not stop if you and your organization have managed to patch the vulnerable systems in your own environment, you need to be really cognizant of what your integrated partners are doing as well in a business to business perspective.
And Tim, just to add on one more point to what you and David just said, I also want to call attention to shadow IT in this instance. So even if you think you have a really good handle on managing your software and infrastructure assets, do consider shadow IT and what complexities this could bring into controlling a Log4j vulnerability and keeping a handle of it within your ecosystem.
Great point. And just to sort of explain the slide where it's really not intended to be anything more than a bit of a few pointers in terms of what are the sorts of capabilities within your security organizations will have relevant data points and relevancy to any communications on the topic of our risk exposure or our potential impact, right? You probably want to collect information from a lot, if not all of these functions and more. I will just add, if anyone has questions, we are hoping this to be fairly relaxed, fairly conversational. Please do ask your questions. They will, come through the Q&A function, and we have people monitoring it, and we'll try and keep an eye out. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask for them, and we'll try and address them as we go. And we'll also have some time at the end to just review and make sure that we've covered everyone's points. So I'll move on to what we thought of as question number 2. So we've touched on this a little bit, but yeah, if one having articulated the full potential impact and relevant relative exposure of the organization and its business ecosystem to this vulnerability, you're probably going to get followed up with the question, have you contained the situation? Did we deal with it adequately or appropriately or comprehensively or completely, if there's a sense of achieving 100% security, which is not always going to be achievable, if at all. So with this one, David, do you want to tackle the first pass?
Absolutely. When it comes to this particular situation, a lot of it ties into incident response, patch management, and 0-day vulnerability response, right? So this is a good pressure test opportunity in organizations' incident response plans to understand what processes, communication plans, and efforts and steps need to be taken whenever a 0-day happens like this. And a lot of us have lessons learned from SolarWinds last year, but taking that into this level of scale when it comes to the software side of the house of the dependencies that are required that we talked about. So really digging into, as a part of the response plan, I'll say it 3 times because it's important: documentation, documentation, and documentation. So in order to be in a defensible position, right, in the future, the board may ask this question, the audit committee, internal audit, they're going to want to know, hey, what was your response for Log4j? So you can show them not only the incident response plan, but the emergency change processes that you executed, the people that were involved, the systems that were patched, how those systems are related to critical processes, et cetera, so that whenever you do call out documentation, you can also tie it back to a process that was executed, in addition to how you stratified your process, right? So, a lot of the clients that I've spoken with in the last month, they prioritize the external attack surface first to make sure that, threat actors couldn't easily get in from the outside. And then they worked their way from the outside in. And of course, they covered their cloud environments as well. So you want to make sure that that documentation is there so that, again, if any type of regulator comes in and says, okay, there was a incident in your environment, how has this tied back to your Log4j remediation processes? And you can demonstrate the due care that you took into place. And then also providing additional validation through containerization, containing the threat through network segmentation, so that whenever there are Log4j instances in your environment, you can also segment those from other critical environments from your network, would be an ideal recommendation as well. So I'll turn it back over to you, Tim and LeeAnne.
Great. LeeAnne?
Yeah,
Oh.
so David was spot on and hit on a lot of fantastic points. I just want to emphasize, we all know as security professionals, but sometimes folks outside of the realm with a more business-oriented lens forget. Recovery is not a point in time experience. You do not just recover, put a bow on it and say, wow, we did great. Recovery is an ongoing process. It's about coming back stronger. It's about sitting down, having those lessons learned meetings, saying, where could we have saved time? When time is up, time is of the essence. Simple things like that documentation David mentioned, but very simple things, knowing who to contact, having a business impact analysis completed so you know where your crown jewels are and you're not left trying to identify the keys to the castle, having a super easy to follow call tree. Those things are often overlooked because when you're having the most stressful day of your life and you're trying to figure out how to put out a huge fire, hindsight's 20/20. So sometimes by identifying those really simple kinks in the hose and addressing them, you can come back stronger. So that's definitely something, a way to answer this question and kind of frame it to the board. If the board says, well, are you done? Is it contained? Did you finish up? Kind of emphasizing that we'll never be finished. Cybersecurity will never be perfect. So it's essential for us to keep getting stronger, keep coming back better, and making sure that we use every single opportunity like what we're faced with right now, or someone said in the chat, like COVID. We use these opportunities to come back better because next time we'll be more prepared and it'll be smoother.
Absolutely. I always talk about cyber resilience as the ability to withstand an incident and recover to an evolved state. And another phrase that springs to mind listening to you there, LeeAnne, is the day of the dance is not the day to learn to dance. So when David was saying document, I was thinking, and on the end of it, rehearse, practice. Absolutely. That's kind of a little bit of a what more could you have done? I guess is the situation contained and dealt with adequately? I know when we were brainstorming this content, right, we talked about how, and funny that there's been a comparison to COVID, right? It's a little bit like that. How will we know it's over? Well, it probably never will be, right? This will be something that becomes an enduring vulnerability that always needs to be thought about and addressed in development in the future, as well as retrospectively throughout production at the moment, like we're doing in our tactical and operational responses. So it needs to be kind of embedded into future thinking, but that's also where you can then take those lessons learned and apply them, and demonstrably so. Okay, let's move on. I'll just check. In the chat, in the Q&A, we've got a question. Are there any tools available to scan or for scanning? David, do you want to talk about that?
There is a open sourced from GitHub you can look at. It's called the Log4j scanner that the CISA government agency released. I'll go ahead and paste the link right to you in the chat there. But yes, that is a scanner that is widely used and recommended for detecting Log4j. Okay.
And there's another question in here. LeeAnne, you mentioned shadow IT. Anthony is asking, can we dig a little deeper on shadow IT for limiting risk exposure?
Yeah, definitely. So shadow IT is a thorn in pretty much everyone's sides these days, just because it's so easy to choose a tool that helps you be more productive, to download it. If you have local admin, you can really, the world is your oyster in terms of what you can put on corporate assets. My favorite thing to do outside of course, managing software and deploying tools to kind of limit functionality on your employees' devices, I am a firm believer in training and awareness. I really, really believe in bringing employees into the fold and letting them know security actually is your responsibility. And I know we all say that security is everyone's responsibility, but I always try to make that personal connection and have folks know that they're not just a cog in the machine. They could very literally be the hole in the balloon where all the air sinks out. So one suggestion is to welcome employees to self-report. It's fine. If you're using a piece of software outside of our software catalog, you're not going to get penalized. It's fine. I just want to do my due diligence to make sure that it's secure. So you can go through a formal process. Let's see if we can get that approved. Let's see if there are any concerns. Make it a friendly environment. There's no risk, and you're encouraging employees to come forward and be completely transparent with you. Shadow IT is one of those things that I think we're really, really going to have a better handle on in coming years. But right now, with cloud technology, for instance, and the fact everything's going to the cloud, the fact a lot of orgs give people local admin permissions because it really does make their lives on the back end so much easier. I think right now it's just a huge issue. So I think transparency is the best way to go.
Yeah, I like it. An amnesty. Don't be that application owner. You don't want your shadow application out there in a vulnerable state to be the source of a compromise, right? So yeah, awareness is a great tool in this fight. Okay, moving on, because conscious of time. So the next heavy hitting question, and again, we've touched on this, but as an overarching subject for the board. So David, tell us, what due diligence and assurances have been conducted?
The key here is providing the board and whoever's asking the audit committee, the C-suite, assurance that there's objectivity in the analysis, especially for any type of environment that's has a lot of open source software that has, spans across geographic borders, is under a lot of regulatory scrutiny from either CCPA, GDPR, et cetera. The analysis that proves that the Log4j vulnerability has been mitigated, in addition to subsequent follow-on tests to prove that the exploits that have been created in the wild cannot be taken advantage of or actually successfully exploited in your environment. So it is recommended to provide a second set of eyes for environments that have that heavily regulated scrutiny, in addition to, really demonstrating that the Log4j vulnerability has been mitigated, and then a subsequent follow-up, either breach a simulation. There are tools out there that will allow you to actually replicate an exploitation of Log4j. So providing that type of additional assurance to the board and the C-suite that, not only did we patch it, we mitigated it, we identified all the instances of the utilization of it, but also we took that extra step to either leverage a third-party solution or leverage a third-party firm to go in and validate that we are not at risk for this vulnerability being exploited.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think that, there's different levels to this, isn't there, of how do you gain assurance that you've done all of the right things. The obvious one is bringing in independent experts, but it can equally be that we've used tools, we've used threat intelligence, from independent specialists, and quite often, and I know this from firsthand in some of my experience in my past lives, is you can be driven to do things by multiple different stakeholders in different ways. So it's always a great thing to achieve if you can demonstrate compliance with various standards, various legal and regulatory requirements and obligations within a single piece of work. But that in itself is no mean feat, right? There's a lot of complexity to unpack there. So I guess my heed there is, don't underestimate the importance of being able to demonstrate due diligence and evidence the work that you've done, and how it's effective. Even if you think about something as simple as a compromise assessment, how do you show that you've undertaken that compromise assessment across the right scope of the enterprise. And again, that would tie back to things like we've prioritized it based upon this level of application criticality, based on a robust application risk assessment process and data classification scheme, right? And things like that. So being able to unpack your answers like that with more and more data points to demonstrate that you've done the right things is absolutely important. LeeAnne, what were your thoughts on this one?
So this question I really, really like. I actually just want to close with one comment I had from a client I was talking to last week. We were on the phone, it's like late Friday night, and we had actually just finished up a compromise assessment for this client before Log4j entered the picture. And I was catching up with him, seeing how he was doing. His head hadn't popped above water in quite a while. And he was telling me how he essentially had to convince his board to give him additional funding for a Log4j specific comp assessment. And he really summarized it by saying, you know what, LeeAnne, if they find nothing in that compromise assessment, it will be the best $50K I've ever spent because I will be able to go to sleep. He is taking the pressure off of him and his team by resting assured, due diligence assurances. He is resting assured that the work has been done and that he is safe. So just wanted to kind of share that nugget. I thought it was a really good quote, because at the end of the day, if you do fall victim to this exploit, it's going to cost a lot more than it does to have those assurances done.
Yeah, great point. Which ties back to the first question of have we fully understood the potential impact and the costs associated with that, right? Which is pretty wide and varied consequences to the business. Okay, I think moving on to the next one, because it's a kind of an extension of that one. And David, again, you alluded to this earlier. If your board asks you, how would we reply to the regulator or any other invested party or supervisory authority, someone that has the right to inquire as to how well you've addressed this situation, where would we go from there? LeeAnne, I see you're taking a sip. So David, I'll go to you first.
Right. It's really
great
looking
timing.
at the timeline of, we consider December 10th for this variant as day zero. So what actions were taken on day zero from today in terms of the discovery, the mitigation, the lessons learned? Regulators are going to want to know, how robust is your asset inventory in terms of where Log4j lives within the environment? And then also, what communications occurred if there was a potential instance of compromise of Log4j? Was the regulatory authority notified in a timely manner? Obviously, we know that in the GDPR, there's a 72-hour breach notification window. If there's any contracts that are required from a third-party perspective, if they've been compromised, did they let you know as the entity that there has been an instance of Log4j being exposed, right? So making sure all those communication protocols are sound or bulletproof in terms of not only the internal constituents, but the external constituents. And if there is suspicion of exploitation or compromise, making sure that you have that right retainer in place, with a forensics and incident response firm, in addition to your external counsel being notified that there is suspicion of compromise, so that you can take immediate action. And that's another thing. We've seen clients that don't have incident response retainers, and that's definitely something that's now industry almost required practice. When we do assessments, it's one of the top questions we asked is, do you have a retainer at the ready, on speed dial? So that, because one of the things, if you look at the FTC guidance, and I'll read it verbatim, it really goes into, okay, if the organization fails to take reasonable steps to protect consumer data from exposure as a result of Log4j or similar vulnerabilities in the future. So we know that this isn't going to be the first time we've seen Eternal Blue, we've seen SolarWinds, now we're seeing Log4j. A lot of these vulnerabilities, they promulgate, and there's a question in the chat, and I'll answer it now. If you look at history repeating itself, Eternal Blue came out and multiple polymorphic payloads came out from Eternal Blue when it comes to WannaCry and NotPetya. So I predict, if I'm reading the tea leaves, this type of variant could last anywhere between 12 to 18 months in terms of the impact. So if you look at that and you look at recent breach case studies that resulted in regulatory sanctions, Equifax, the fine was at $700 million. There is going to be continuous focus from a threat actor perspective to create those variants that take advantage of this vulnerability. So all that being said, just proving that you've done everything you can to protect yourself and contain the threat from materializing.
Thanks, David. And I think an important point there, right, and follow on is, it's again, a regulator is not going to expect you to have instantly remediated or mitigated or even avoided in the first place, right? These types of incidents. But what they are looking for is that you have done your due diligence up front, that you weren't completely underprepared, that you actually detected this thing, if it impacts you, as early as possible, or reasonable, and we're working with all the right stakeholders, communicating. It's about showing that you had all of the right processes in place to minimize the impact on those that are affected. And specifically, a lot of the times when regulators are involved, we're talking about the data points are your clients. It's them that this has an impact if their personal identifiable data is stolen, or if it's something that represents potential systemic risk to an industry sector. So I think it's not something to be afraid of or shy away from. It's something that you just need to really be transparent with, and because that even comes back to the point we made in the previous slide, which is, even if you fell victim, you were vulnerable, you had an exploit, and an impact was leveraged against your organization, if you've dealt with it, if you've tackled it and you've addressed it, and then you've learned a load of lessons from going through that experience, again, that can paint you in a better light than the opposite. LeeAnne, what were your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so David and you, Tim, did a fantastic job covering this one. There's just one tidbit of information that I want to add, just based on something that a lot of clients aren't aware of. So we can all pretty much agree that it is not if an organization suffers a breach, it's when, right? In today's age, pretty much everyone is going to fall victim to a breach in some capacity or another. A lot of times organizations don't form relationship with external counsel until the day of, till they're actively triaging that breach and trying to figure out what they should be doing. I like to tell my clients, reach out to your external counsel, form those relationships nice and early, share your incident response plan with them, get their thoughts, get their cell phone number, figure out what their internal process is for escalating an incident. David mentioned retainers. Make sure you're super familiar with your retainer. Form those relationships early, because when you are, once again, triaging what could be the worst day of your life, probably the worst day at work that you've had in quite a while, the benefit's going to come back tenfold by having those strong relationships in place, knowing who your key contacts are, having an understanding about what the internal process escalation is. So I invite you all to take a look at your IRP and make sure that you're including that sort of legal capacity or regulatory capacity in your plan.
Yeah, great point. Great point. And you just reminded me of another thing that I thought about when David was talking, which is, in multinational organizations, it's a really important to have proactively engaged with legal to understand your obligations for different regulators in different jurisdictions, because it's not always going to be just one. It might be multiple that you need to communicate with. It might be multiple that you need to satisfy and report to. There was another point that I thought of as well, which is just potentially worth making, which is all too often when planning, would my regulator be interested in this? Sometimes it's the regulators have advanced their understanding of the threat landscape. And I think previously there was a lot of assumptions that if data wasn't stolen, then potentially they're not that interested. But actually, I've seen papers by regulators stating how even if there is no immediate evidence, so if the incident is alerted based on a ransomware event or just an exploit attempt, if you've got an adversary positioned in your organization with potential access to data, they are still going to be interested in what you did about it, even if you currently have no evidence that data has been taken outside of the organization, because you are in a position where you need to now show, well, we took it from that event and we worked backwards and forwards across the kill chain to understand what could have happened, what has happened. And so again, I think you made the point about the incident response plan and having your retainers, these specialists coming in and really carrying out that full investigation so that you do understand and have some assurances as to what has happened. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. I know there is a question in the Q&A, but I think I'll try and find a better time to answer it. I just wanted to make sure we cover this last one, because I think it's a real like finale, right? We are supposing here that the board of directors will turn around to you when you are reporting on Log4j and ask the challenging question of what more should we be doing? And I really hope they do ask this question. And if they don't, you should be hand delivering the answers anyway, because this is what we're trying to articulate here, is this global event is a true opportunity to really kind of capitalize on. So I went to you first last time, David. LeeAnne, I'll come to you this time. What do you think about this killer question?
Yeah, so I like the term next gen security. I feel like we talk about a lot of next gen products, but we don't necessarily talk as an industry about next gen security. How can we level up our security? I think a lot of times we talk about things in theory, but we don't give actionable solutions. So I actually want to shift our attention over to the capabilities. I think that is really where we can dive into the meat of this slide. So first and foremost, data-driven and threat-informed strategic planning. Data-driven decision-making. That is something that I've heard in the security industry probably since like 2011. People started saying data-driven decision-making. I want to make decisions with data. I don't want to rely on the human component anymore. I want my security decisions to be backed with empirical evidence. That is something that there are discrete projects, right? And capabilities where you can equip yourself with the data to make those sort of decisions. And Tim, I see we have purple teaming listed here, right? That's a fantastic sort of engagement where you can collect data. For those of you who are unfamiliar, purple teaming is where the blue teams and red teams work together to kind of tune detective and defensive measures and become better at defending and detecting against malicious payloads or other sort of threats. So doing exercises like that is a great way to collect data to help fuel your sort of strategic planning. It's a great way to highlight what weaknesses you have, highlight what tuning needs to take place, highlight where you need to make investments in your security. Another great thing about that is Once you have that data, you now have numbers that you can take to the board. A lot of things we do in security is squishy. Now we give metrics like, okay, we ran this phishing campaign. It went great. 99% of people didn't click on it, but that's about it. There isn't a whole lot. We say, okay, we patched this many vulnerabilities and this many were high, but the more metrics and numbers we can bring to the board, the better equipped we are to make data-driven decision-making, the better equipped they are to understand the security ecosystem and the footprint of the organization. David, did you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, everything you said was great. And I would just add that, one of the things, just to hook on your theme of next generation security and metrics, a lot of times we see lagging indicators or lagging metrics, like what did you do that over the last 30 days in terms of patching vulnerabilities? Those are easy metrics to report, but we're recommending more what we call leading indicators, activities or behaviors that will prevent a threat from materializing. Like for example, how many third parties have you assessed in the last 30 days that would be considered high risk? So you're getting ahead of those threats. Or how many source code repositories have you sunsetted? Or how many are considered high risk in terms of the source code that's in those repositories? For example, this is more specific to the tech industry. So just as you're reporting those metrics to the board, it's really imperative to provide meaning behind them. And then if you're tying it back to either a ask, whether it's an investment ask of and need to have incremental headcount in order to successfully implement this initiative, or we need to have a CapEx investment or an OpEx investment, you back that up with activities that were done in addition to what a mapping to the business risk is something that I feel like is really important. That'll help, justify that additional spend and the board approving it.
Absolutely. I don't know. I think this might be a good place to answer Mark's question in the chat about, the true complexity of doing IT asset management across a global enterprise, and what does good or better realistically look like. I think that's a massive topic in and of itself. A comment I would make is it's growing towards an acceptance that you will never know 100% of your global enterprise IT estates, and and to the point of this slide, reporting that, you if you don't know what 100% is, you will never be able to, for example, report percentage of coverage of certain tools or policies or anything. So you have to educate the stakeholders around the complexity of that challenge, but I think in be realistic and pragmatic about doing so, right? In that you will never get to that point because of the shadow IT that we talked about earlier, because of the ever growing, it's like, how do you track 100% of something that is continuously evolving and growing? It's nigh on impossible. So but then it becomes a case of, well, how do we look at it in an alternative lens? And that's where I think that being data driven, being threat informed is really important, because you need to be fully understanding of the really critical crown jewels across your asset estate, and making sure that if you are doing anything anywhere, it is around protecting them, being able to detect things that could be targeting them, because they are essentially a bellwether of, they are going to be the targeted items across your estate by your adversaries. So they are a bellwether of your level of security and resilience. David, LeeAnne, anything to add there?
Yeah, I love this question, Mark, and thanks for bringing it up. And a lot of times when we're doing consulting, we'll make good, better, and best recommendations. So in just a quick corollary, when we're doing compromise assessments, we actually request that we at least get 90% of endpoint coverage when we're doing our analysis in terms of the endpoint assets. So that's just a sidebar data point. But when it comes to good, better, best, my mind gravitated around, okay, good, having some type of IT asset management system in place, right? And there's a confidence index of 90% or better of that inventory is 90% or above accurate. It's been reviewed, and there is ownership and active management. Better would be that plus asset owners, application owners, and that inventory is reviewed on a quarterly basis. And from an asset accuracy perspective, it would be great to have it to be 99% or more. And of course, best would be 100% accurate. You're also tracking for application drift, config drift. You're also taking into account the ephemeral nature of cloud environments, so that you're constantly updating your asset inventory for containers and workloads that have sensitive information. So that would be best in my mind. I know that's definitely a utopia, and there's not too many organizations that have that best definition, but that would be something that we would recommend, especially in a highly dynamic environment.
Yeah, some this is quite ephemeral, but some like emerging practices of triangulation of asset information, right? So there is in very scarce times is there a single source of truth. So it's about triangulating data points across multiple sources of truth and making the data in aggregate be a better reflection of good and better. I just thought I'd add in that point. LeeAnne, anything finally before I move on?
I think you guys answered it absolutely perfect. I would just say keep an eye on Palo Alto Networks, because we might have something cooking up to address this exact question.
Great plug. Okay, finally, and this is what we've started calling our 5 E's of communicating to the board. The E's of communicating to the board. If it only it were easy. So just a quick sort of recap on, we've covered some of the big heavy hitting questions we think you might get asked or you should be preparing to answer. And this is just more some pointers about how you go about that communication. So empathy, being really cognizant of what it is that the board is going to be expecting, and what are their concerns, because they are going to be undoubtedly different to your more operational and tactical concerns. And it's going to be, you need to be engaging them on business risk and how you are enabling the business to achieve its objectives through the security and resilience work that you're doing. Education, we've talked about it here. LeeAnne mentioned it. Awareness doesn't stop at the general population, doesn't stop at yourselves. It is, you are there as subject matter experts in the boardroom, so you need to be going above and beyond. We all know that you need to keep your communications concise and crisp and articulate, but you are there as a expert, and you need to be conveying expertise, experience, and knowledge to the board to be able to empower them, which is I've just given a precursor to the final one. Be engaging as well. Like, don't just go there and preach, don't just go there and pitch. Give them the direction to understand the true requirements of the cybersecurity organization, but then also deliver them the insight and the information they need to make those decisions, the right decisions. Go in with evidence, right? Be, as we said, data driven in your approach. Take in data points from everywhere that you can get them. Again, don't overload them with data. Make sure it's relevant to the decisions that you're going to be asking them to make. And typically that will be decisions that will be helping you mitigate risk, minimize impact, and keep them, like I say, in business fundamentally. And empower them. Like, this is a great opportunity to communicate. It's got board attention. It's on the agenda of all the boards because it's such a massive scale, highly potentially impactful vulnerability. So seize the opportunity to help create a culture that can be pushed top down from board level, senior executives down into every employee, so that it really kind of crystallizes that culture of we all own security together. And events like this really underline that. Something as simple as a component part of software that is ubiquitous can and will inevitably be targeted by our adversaries. And if they find something, then we're going to have to deal with it. As I said at the top of the hour, this isn't a threat briefing. This isn't a vulnerability detailed analysis. However, we do that. We have, I think, probably more than a single blog, but we have blogged about this topic. We have a resource center available on our website that has a lot of information about Log4j, Log4Shell, and we have got great threat researchers who have delivered probably more than they care to mention threat briefings over the last month. There is one for sure that is available on demand at the URL there, and we can always share that later on. David, did you want to say a quick word about the compromise assessments that we are doing specifically to help our clients hunt for Log4j exposure?
Absolutely, yes. And one of the things that we're seeing is if clients don't have an EDR solution, and even clients that do have an EDR solution, we're still recommending that extra step is taking to do a compromise assessment. So first, the initial step is that we do install our Cortex XDR agent in order to conduct the compromise assessment that actually has the forensic capability embedded into it that has been added over the last 6 months. So first, we would the compromise assessment would stop the bleeding. It would block the exploit from happening. And then it would identify vulnerable applications, like I mentioned before, that 90% or plus, where we're really looking to get as much of the environment as possible. If we can hit 100%, absolutely. But once we have that agent installed, we'll be able to identify instances and actually hunt for Log4j. And then, of course, if Log4j is identified as having the vulnerable version, we'll determine if there's indicators of the compromise on the actual endpoint. And then we'll look for any indicators of lateral movement or persistence mechanisms that have been installed or any other backdoors. And then, of course, we'll remediate. And then throughout the whole compromise assessment, there's a lot of proactive communication that's happening on a daily basis to let the client know that, hey, this is what we found. This is what we're doing. We wouldn't pull the trigger on any type of remediation activities without their consent. So it's definitely something we strongly recommend.
Great. And with that, we are bang on the top of the hour. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A. I think, David, do you want to take Eamon's question about the app libraries?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, really, if the lowest common denominator is your data. So really, from a data perspective, that is kind of like your primary key from an asset management perspective. So wherever your sensitive crown jewel key asset data information is, that should be the correlation, whether you have it at the lowest common denominator as an app library or a container, your data is king or queen.
Absolutely. And then the final one from William about in what ways can a vulnerability used by an attacker be used against the attacker to hunt them down? LeeAnne, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so this is a core offensive security question. I think the fastest way to answer this question would be explore things like purple teaming. Get an understanding of how much noise different threats are going to make in your environment if they pass through. Get an understanding of how to tune your defenses to best protect your organization against that particular threat that you're launching. That would be my best suggestion.
Yep. Great stuff. And I could just add 2 quick data points. Offensive security is definitely a sensitive topic in terms of the legal jurisdictions and ramifications. But honeypots, once you feel confident that Log4j is remediated, having a honeypot, and then other deceptive technologies. But before you have the honeypot or deceptive technologies in place, making sure that those systems are well monitoring from a net flow, from a forensics perspective, so you can capture their TTPs.
Yeah, but please don't on your organization's IT anyway, go after the bad guys yourselves. If you do get any impact, report it through the normal channels. But yeah, I think great answers both there, David and LeeAnne. Yeah, the key is learn what the attackers will do to try and leverage this vulnerability, and then make sure you use that to fine tune your prevention and detection controls so that you won't feel any impact, right? And with that, I think we'll conclude today's session. Just a final action plan to leave you with. We've mentioned it across the session. If you haven't already, get a incident response specialist on retainer, so that if the worst day happens, you can call in the cavalry and help you fight and go toe to toe with the adversaries once they're into your environment. If you have any problems, there's numbers there you can call on the screen to call in Unit 42. And with that, I will say thank you very much for your time, for listening. I've definitely had a fantastic hour conversation. Thank you, David. Thank you, LeeAnne. Much appreciate all of your insights. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Having said that, someone's just raised their hand. And I can't see how I go to someone raising their hand. We're not doing live
waving goodbye.
Yeah, maybe it's just a goodbye. Anyway, with that, we will call a conclusion to the session. Thank you, everyone.